All right, so are you ready to dive into a topic that's going to really get those brain cells firing?
Always game. What do we have today?
Well, today we're tackling this book. It takes a very, let's just say, different stance on climate change.
Okay, lay it on me.
The book is The Greatest Hoax: How the Global Warming Conspiracy Threatens Your Future by the late Senator Jim Inhofe.
Senator Inhofe. Okay, so this isn't just another book on climate change, is it?
Not even close.
This is about understanding someone who really went against the grain, right? Someone who stood against, like, the mainstream, especially on climate change.
He was definitely known for that.
So for those of us who might not know him, who is Senator Inhofe?
Senator Inhofe, Republican from Oklahoma, really became known for his really staunch, really firm opposition to the whole idea of, like, man-made climate change.
Interesting. Did he have a particular background that might have influenced that?
Yeah, I think you could say that. He often saw a lot of these environmental issues, climate change included, through the lens of overregulation.
Overregulation. Mean.
Basically, government getting too involved, in our lives and businesses. He was a businessman himself before entering politics, so that experience definitely shaped his views.
Fascinating. So it wasn't just about the environment for him then?
Not really, no. It was tied into his ideas about personal liberty,
Yeah.
economic freedom.
Okay, I'm starting to get a sense of this guy. He was big on individual freedom, distrustful of government intervention. What was his main argument then?
He held nothing back,
Yeah.
calling climate change a complete hoax.
Whoa.
Yeah.
A hoax. You don't just throw that word around lightly. What kind of evidence did he use to back that up?
Well, he really went after, directly challenge the scientific consensus on this, specifically the IPCC.
Okay, and for those who might not be familiar, remind us, who are the IPCC?
Right. So the IPCC, that's the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're considered like the leading authority when it comes to climate science.
Yeah.
Thousands of scientists all over the world involved in their assessments.
Okay, so a major target for Inhofe then.
Absolutely. He didn't just question their methods. He actually suggested they might have a political agenda.
Wow. That's a pretty serious accusation to level against such a respected organization. Did he provide any evidence for that?
He pointed to specific cases that he felt supported this view. Like one example he uses is the resignation of a scientist named Dr. Christopher Lancy.
And who is Dr. Lancy?
So Dr. Lancy was, and I think still is, a pretty respected hurricane expert.
Hurricanes.
Okay. He was part of the IPCC, but then resigned. Now, according to Inhofe, Lancy claimed that the IPCC was pushing this whole narrative, trying to directly link the intensity of hurricanes to, you guessed it, global warming.
And Lancy disagreed with that link.
Disagreeing strongly.
Yeah.
And Inhofe uses that resignation as evidence that there were these biases, within the IPCC itself.
So it wasn't just about the science itself for Inhofe, but about, like you said, potential biases, agendas at play, even within the scientific community.
Exactly.
Did he have any other arguments? I mean, calling something a hoax, you gotta have a lot to back that up.
He did. He argued that this whole idea of public fear was being manipulated to advance what he saw as the climate change agenda.
Articulative.
Well, he pointed fingers at the media, at environmental groups. He said they were using these really emotionally charged images. Remember all those pictures of polar bears clinging to shrinking ice caps?
Oh, yeah. Those were everywhere back then. I remember those. Pretty powerful imagery.
Exactly. And Inhofe knew that. He was saying that they used those images to push this narrative, this idea of a crisis, an urgent crisis, even if the real situation, like with the polar bears, was more complicated than that.
So it was about controlling the narrative for him, using those emotions, that fear, to sway public opinion. This reminds me, didn't something happen back then? Wasn't there a scandal? ClimateGate, I think it was called?
Oh, yeah, ClimateGate. He definitely brought that up.
That whole thing was wild. A lot of people might not even remember it now.
It was huge news, though.
Remind us what that was all about again?
It involved these hacked emails from climate scientists. And the people who hacked these emails, they used them to argue that, get this, that these scientists were manipulating data.
Manipulating data? To do what?
To fit a specific narrative on climate change. Basically, to make the science appear more certain, more alarming than it really was, at least according to the people pushing that angle.
Wow. And Inhofe ate that up, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. For him, ClimateGate was like proof. Like it totally validated his suspicions about potential misconduct in the scientific community.
Even though many scientists said those emails were taken out of context.
Right. And investigations ultimately clear those scientists of the most serious accusations. But I think for Inhofe and others who were already skeptical, ClimateGate just confirmed all their worst fears.
It's amazing how a single event like that can have such a lasting impact on these kinds of debates.
Absolutely. It makes you realize how powerful information is, but also misinformation, in shaping how we think about complex issues.
And how much trust plays a role, because you have to decide who to trust.
Exactly. And Inhofe's whole thing was about questioning who we should trust and why, especially when it comes to powerful institutions. And for him, this tied directly into his really strong criticism of some of the solutions being proposed, especially things like cap and trade policies.
Cap and trade, that was a big one back then. Still is, really. What was his take?
He hated it, absolutely hated it, called it an attack on the American way of life.
Strong words. How so?
He basically said that cap and trade would destroy the economy, kill jobs, and lead to, like, economic devastation for everyday Americans.
So he's really appealing to that fear of economic insecurity, which, let's be honest, a lot of people can relate to. Was he right, though? Did any economists agree with those dire predictions?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
It's like there were these two different realities, you know? And for people like Inhofe, those economic arguments, those fears, they were very real.
Totally. And it all circles back to trust, right? Who do you trust? And Inhofe was really distrustful of government solutions, especially when it came to something as, like, fundamental as energy.
Right. He often talked about how cap and trade would disproportionately hurt the U.S. and benefit developing nations. Like, he was really critical of China.
Because he felt like they were getting a free pass.
Exactly. He saw these policies as basically letting China off the hook while saddling the U.S. with all these economic burdens. And of course, he brought up Al Gore, as he often did.
Right. Al Gore, the poster child for climate action.
Exactly. Inhofe loved to contrast Gore's lifestyle, you know, his big house, private jets, with the kind of sacrifices he was saying ordinary Americans would have to make under cap and trade.
It's a powerful argument, whether you agree with it or not.
Totally. It plays on that idea of hypocrisy, right? The elite telling everyone else to cut back while they continue to live these lavish lifestyles. It's an image that sticks with people.
It does. And it speaks to that deeper distrust of those in power, this feeling that they're not really in touch with the struggles of everyday people.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that these debates, especially around climate change, they're not just about the science. They're about values, about deeply held beliefs about the role of government, about fairness.
It's like, where does the environment even fit in at that point? You know,
Yeah.
it almost feels secondary.
Sometimes, yeah. And I think that's what made Inhofe so fascinating, but also so frustrating for people on the other side of the issue, because he was tapping into these very real anxieties and frustrations, but channeling them in a way that many saw as counterproductive, even dangerous.
It's like, how do you even begin to have a productive conversation, a debate, when you're starting from such different premises?
Right. And that's something we still grapple with today, even more so, I'd say. That polarization, that inability to find common ground. But I think to understand Inhofe's perspective and the perspective of many who agreed with him, you have to go back to this idea of control. He saw climate change as a way for the government to expand its power, to intrude further into people's lives.
And we see this in other areas too, right? Not just climate change.
Absolutely. Like with his views on government spending, he was really, and I mean really, opposed to what he called bureaucratic earmarks.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but honestly, it's always seemed a bit vague. What are bureaucratic earmarks exactly?
Basically, they're these line items hidden in legislation. Yeah, well, not literally hidden, but they're these little provisions tucked into larger bills that direct federal funds to very specific projects or initiatives, often with like very little transparency or debate.
Sounds sneaky.
You could say that. And Inhofe saw them as this really shady way for unelected bureaucrats to basically funnel money to their pet projects, you know? And they could do it without any real oversight from Congress, from the people
Yeah.
who are supposed to be controlling the purse strings.
Okay, I see why he'd be against that. It sounds like he saw it as a form of corruption, like a way for the government to waste taxpayer money, maybe even enrich special interests.
Exactly. He even contrasted bureaucratic earmarks with something he called congressional earmarks.
Wait, wasn't he against all earmarks?
He was, but he drew a distinction.
Okay, I'm curious. How did he distinguish those?
So congressional earmarks are different in the sense that they involve elected officials, right? Members of Congress who are, at least in theory, accountable to their constituents. Inhofe argued that while congressional earmarks could definitely be bad, pork barrel spending and all that, at least there was some level of transparency. Voters could see where the money was going, who was benefiting, and hold their representatives accountable.
So it's about transparency for him and accountability. He felt like the bureaucratic earmarks lacked that.
Exactly. He saw those bureaucratic earmarks as a symptom of this larger problem, this growing power of these unelected bureaucrats.
And the erosion of congressional authority.
Exactly. He felt like Congress was being sidelined, that they were giving away their power, and that unelected bureaucrats were basically running the show.
And he connected that to climate change.
He did. Because, see, for Inhofe, this wasn't just about wasteful spending. This was about a fundamental shift in the balance of power. He believed this trend, this move towards bureaucratic control, was a real threat to democracy. And he saw the whole climate change issue, and especially the solutions being proposed, as part of this larger problem.
That's interesting because, in a way, it makes sense, right? If you believe that these unelected bureaucrats are calling the shots and that they're using climate change to justify expanding their power, then it's not such a leap to see those bureaucratic earmarks as a way to fund the whole thing.
Exactly. Like a direct line from those hidden earmarks to, say, funding for climate change research, to the scientists he believed were pushing a politically motivated agenda. It all fits together in his worldview.
So it becomes this kind of self-reinforcing cycle, at least in his mind. And it's all about control. But if he didn't trust the government, he definitely didn't trust the media either, did he?
Not at all. In fact, he was incredibly critical of how the media covered climate change. He basically accused them of being complicit in what he called the global warming hoax. He had some really harsh words for journalists and news organizations.
Like what? What did he accuse them of doing?
Well, he said they were hyping the issue, sensationalizing the science.
To sell papers, to get ratings.
Exactly. He felt like they were more interested in scaring people than in presenting a balanced, accurate view of the science. And perhaps even more importantly, he accused them of silencing dissenting voices.
So anyone who disagreed with the mainstream narrative on climate change.
Exactly. He felt like there was no space for debate, no room for alternative perspectives. And again, this all ties back to his point about fear-mongering, right? How the media uses these emotional images, this alarmist language, to manipulate public opinion.
Which he felt was being done deliberately to advance a particular agenda.
Precisely. And for Inhofe, it all pointed back to this idea of a conspiracy. This network of powerful institutions, the government, the scientific community, the media, all working together to silence opposition and push this agenda.
It's a powerful narrative even if you don't buy into the whole conspiracy theory aspect of it.
It is, and it speaks to this deeper anxiety that many people feel, this sense that things are slipping out of control, that the world is changing too fast, and that those in power are either incompetent or, even worse, actively working against the interests of everyday people.
It's like, who do you trust? Who do you believe?
Exactly. And in that environment, in that climate of distrust and uncertainty, it's easy to see how someone like Inhofe could gain a following. He offered a simple explanation for a complex problem, and he wasn't afraid to point fingers and name names. He gave people someone to claim, a target for their anger and frustration.
And in a way, that can be very appealing, especially when you're feeling overwhelmed or powerless.
Absolutely. But it's also dangerous because it can lead to these echo chambers where people only hear information that confirms their existing biases.
And it makes it even harder to have those productive conversations, those open and honest debates that we need to address these complex challenges.
Exactly, and that's something we're still grappling with today, even more so, I'd say. And the question is, how do we move forward? How do we bridge these divides and find common ground? Because ultimately, whether you agree with Inhofe or not, climate change is a challenge we all have to face together.
And speaking of challenges, Inhofe certainly faced his share of criticism, didn't he? I mean, he was basically accusing the entire scientific community of being part of a giant hoax.
Right. And that's one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy, for sure. But to understand his perspective, you have to remember, he wasn't just coming at this from a scientific standpoint.
It was much more about ideology for him, about his deeply held beliefs, about the role of government, about individual liberty, about freedom. He really seemed to have this thing about slippery slopes when it came to government, didn't he? Like one step in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And it's all downhill from there.
Oh, absolutely. He saw everywhere. Environmental regulations, slippery slope, health care, another slippery slope, education reform, Don't even get him started. It was a
Yeah.
consistent theme in his thinking.
And climate change was no different. Just another example of this government overreach he was so worried about.
Exactly. Like with cap and trade, he saw that as like the poster child for government intrusion into the free market.
Because it's putting a price on something that was always basically free.
Right.
Carbon emissions.
Right. And for him, that was the whole point. It's about the government picking winners and losers, dictating how businesses operate, ultimately limiting individual choice, that freedom to choose how you live, how you run your business.
It all sounds very big government versus small government.
Totally. And he really played up those fears of what could happen if the government gets too much power. He would talk about things like economic stagnation, job losses.
Rationing even, right?
Oh, yeah, he'd go there. He really painted this picture of like a dystopian future where the government controls every aspect of the economy and individual liberty is basically a thing of the past.
It's a pretty bleak outlook.
It is, but you have to remember, for a lot of people, those fears are very real, and they go back to the very founding of this country, that fight for independence, for freedom from an oppressive government.
So Inhofe was tapping into something very deep, very ingrained in the American psyche.
Exactly, that distrust of centralized power. And he was basically saying, look, this is happening again. This time it's climate change, but the principle is the same. It's like, whether you agree with him on the science or not, you can at least understand where that fear, that distrust is coming from.
Right, and I think that's important to remember, especially when we're talking about these complex, often contentious issues. It's easy to just dismiss people who disagree with us, to write them off as like uninformed or irrational. But the reality is, people's beliefs, even those that seem extreme, they're often rooted in something deeper.
Their values, their experiences, their worldview.
Exactly. And until we understand those underlying factors, those deeper motivations, it's going to be very difficult to have productive conversations, let alone find common ground.
Because how do you even begin to bridge that gap if you're not even speaking the same language, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's something we see playing out all around us today, right? This incredible polarization, not just on climate change, but on so many issues. It's like we're living in these separate realities, and the gap between them just keeps getting wider.
So as we try to navigate this minefield of climate change, all the complexities, all the different perspectives, what do we do with someone like Inhofe? How do we reconcile his views, which were so far outside the mainstream, with the very real challenges we're facing? What can we learn from him, even if we disagree with his conclusions?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do think there are a few key takeaways from Inhofe's story, even if you completely reject his stance on climate change.
Okay, like what
Yeah.
are some of those takeaways?
Well, first, I think Inhofe understood the power of narrative. Maybe better than anyone, he was a master storyteller. I mean, you have to give him that.
Yeah, he definitely knew how to capture an audience.
He did, and he understood that facts and figures, data points, they're just not enough to persuade people, especially when it comes to something as emotionally charged as climate change. You have to appeal to their hearts, not just their heads. You have to tell a story that resonates with their values, their experiences, even their fears.
He connected with people on a gut level.
Exactly. And while some people might have seen his tactics as manipulative, and maybe they were, you can't deny that they were effective. And I think that's a lesson that those who are serious about addressing climate change would do well to learn from. It's not enough to just be right. You have to be persuasive. You have to be able to tell a compelling story.
That's interesting, because so much of the communication around climate change has been very, like, fact-based.
Yeah.
Scientists presenting data, talking about graphs and charts, which is important, don't get me wrong.
Of course.
But it's not always the most engaging way to reach people, is it?
Not at all. And I think Inhofe understood that instinctively. Another thing he understood, and this is a bit more controversial, is the power of doubt, especially when it comes to science.
Because science is often messy, right? It's not always clear-cut.
Right. And Inhofe was a master at exploiting that. He would highlight the uncertainties, the complexities, the times when scientists got things wrong.
Which, let's be honest, does happen.
It does. And he would use those examples to create this sense of doubt, this idea that maybe we don't know as much as we think we do.
Even if those examples didn't necessarily invalidate the overall scientific consensus.
Exactly. And I'm not saying he was right to do that, but I do think it's a reminder that science is an ongoing process, and our understanding of complex systems like the climate is always evolving. It's good to be skeptical, to question, To not just blindly accept everything we're told, even if it comes from experts.
So critical thinking is key.
Absolutely. And I think that's something Inhofe would agree with, even if we disagree about everything else. And finally, and this is something I really admire about him, Inhofe was never afraid to stand up for what he believed in, even when it meant going against the grain, challenging his own party, risking his political career. He was a fighter, and you have to respect that, even if you didn't agree with him.
Yeah, he definitely stood his ground. And it's a good reminder for all of us, I think, that we have a responsibility to speak up, to engage in this debate, even when it's difficult, even when it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Because democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires all of us to be informed, to be engaged, to hold our leaders accountable, and to never stop questioning, never stop seeking the truth.
Well said.
Mm-hmm.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive into Senator Inhofe's The Greatest Hoax. It's been quite a journey, exploring the mind of a man who, let's face it, was a lightning rod for controversy.
He definitely was that, but I think hopefully we've shown that even the most seemingly outlandish viewpoints often have a story behind them. And by trying to understand those stories, by looking beyond the sound bites and the labels, we can maybe start to bridge some of these divides that seem to dominate our world today.
Here's hoping. Well, it was a fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive. We hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, keep those brain cells firing.